There comes a moment in life when you grow tired of being bruised by the world, its betrayals, rejections, and chaos. You start to ask, how do I protect myself without losing who I am? In the pursuit of strength, many become cold. But what if true invincibility was never about shutting down your heart? What if it was about knowing yourself so deeply that nothing could shake your center? In this journey, we will explore the wisdom that leads to being untouchable, not because you're armored but because you are awake. Stay until the end, because what you will discover could reshape the way you relate to pain, power, and peace. There is a kind of power that does not need to shout. It does not demand applause. It is not defined by dominance, nor measured by how many wounds it can endure without flinching. It is quiet, steady, and wholly self-possessed. Many people spend their lives attempting to become untouchable by hardening themselves, by constructing walls so tall that no pain can reach them. But in doing so, they also block out the sunlight. They become shadows of themselves, disconnected from the world that once moved them. They confuse invulnerability with numbness. But there is another path, a far more demanding and transformative one. To become whole. To be whole is not to be perfect. It is to be complete, to know your contradictions, and carry them with dignity. It is to look deeply into the mirror of the unconscious, and not turn away when the shadow begins to rise. It is through this integration that you become untouchable. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. You cease to be fragmented. The world may strike, but it cannot unravel what has already been sewn back together with the golden thread of awareness. True resilience, then, does not grow from coldness. It arises from the crucible of self-confrontation. You cannot expect to rise above emotional turmoil without first descending into it. You must pass through the storm, not around it. This is the fundamental psychological law. What you resist persists. If you ignore your inner wounds, in the name of strength, they will surface in more destructive ways, through projections, anger, avoidance, or apathy. But if you face them, understand their origin, and hold them in compassionate awareness, they will teach you, and through that teaching, you will become powerful in a way that is not brittle, but expansive. Most people try to protect themselves by becoming less sensitive. They say, I don't care anymore, or nothing bothers me. But the soul does not operate by these artificial boundaries. If you convince yourself not to feel, you also sever the channels through which meaning flows. Joy and sorrow come through the same doorway. To shut one is to dim the other. A man who no longer feels grief has also lost the capacity for deep love. The problem is not sensitivity, is unprocessed emotion. When emotion is denied, it becomes a tyrant. When it is acknowledged, it becomes a guide. To become untouchable is to know that you are not defined by every wave that passes through your emotional sea. You are the ocean, not the weather. You learn to hold your ground, not by bracing against life, but by surrendering to its currents, while remaining anchored in your own depths. The one who has befriended the unconscious no longer fears the unknown. And that is where freedom lives in, knowing that you are capable of sitting in discomfort without fleeing from it or numbing yourself against it. The second great illusion on this path is that protection must come through isolation, that to avoid being hurt, one must push others away, maintain a constant emotional distance, and never reveal too much of the self. But this is a boundary, confused with a barrier. Boundaries, when they arise from self-respect, are not walls, they are gates. They communicate. This is where I end, and you begin. They are not rejections of connection, but conditions for it. A healthy psyche knows how to assert itself without becoming hostile. It speaks truth without venom. It listens without losing itself. You see, people do not become cold because they are strong. They become cold because they are afraid. Afraid of being seen. Afraid of being hurt again. Afraid of vulnerability that was once punished, dismissed, or mocked. And in response to that fear, they create personas of indifference. Masks of strength that are void of warmth. But this is not wholeness. It is fragmentation. A mask can protect you, yes, but only from love, from trust, from life itself. Eventually, that armor becomes a prison. What is needed instead is clarity. And clarity begins with the self. You must ask, what am I willing to tolerate? Where do I end? What energies will I allow into my life? And which ones will I now respectfully decline? When you answer these questions not out of bitterness, but out of self-awareness, your boundaries become acts of love. Love for yourself, and love for others, who deserve to meet the real you, not the wounded, defensive shell, but the conscious soul behind it. Being untouchable, in this light, is not about not being hurt. It is about not being ruled by the hurt. It is about knowing that you can let someone close. And if they break your trust, you can grieve and heal without abandoning your capacity to trust altogether. It is about experiencing disappointment and not making it a permanent philosophy of despair. That is maturity. That is psychological sovereignty. And it cannot be faked. There is a profound strength in being able to say, no, not with anger, but with finality, to walk away, not to punish, but to preserve peace, to let go, not because you don't care, but because you care enough about your sanity, your dignity, and your growth to stop feeding cycles that drain your essence. The untouchable person is not above emotion. They are just no longer enslaved by it. They do not react, they respond. And that is the mark of integration. In a world that is noisy, reactive, and driven by appearances, emotional stillness becomes a revolutionary act. But let us be clear, stillness is not the same as passivity. It is not weakness dressed up in poetic words. Stillness is a stance, an inner posture that says, I will not be moved by every gust of wind. I will not collapse at every conflict. I will remain here, rooted in who I am. That kind of stillness radiates power. It is magnetic. It makes others pause, reflect, and often project because it exposes their own lack of self-regulation. And this is the danger. The more whole you become, the more you will trigger the unconsciousness in others. Your peace will unnerve those who thrive on chaos. Your clarity will feel confrontational to those who rely on manipulation. Your emotional maturity will appear cold to the emotionally erratic. But this is not your burden to carry. Your task is not to dim your light to comfort the disoriented, is to remain true to your center. And that center can only be cultivated in solitude, in silence, in the inner dialogue between the ego and the self. The ego says, control everything. The self says, surrender to the process. The ego fears loss, rejection, betrayal. The self understands that these experiences are part of the alchemical journey. They burn away illusions. They refine the soul. And when you stop resisting these initiations, you stop being destroyed by them. You begin to alchemize them. You become the philosopher's stone, not because life no longer hurts, but because hurt no longer defines your identity. There is a reason the most powerful people are often the calmest. They have seen their own madness and survived it. They have walked through shame, anger, confusion, and grief not by avoiding it, but by facing it until it lost its power. And in doing so, they became unshakable. Not robotic, not detached, but free. Their power lies not in how many battles they win, but in how few they need to fight. They have nothing to prove. They no longer chase validation. They do not need to be understood. They simply are. And this, perhaps, is the greatest paradox. The more you know yourself, the less the world can touch you. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you are no longer dependent on it for your sense of worth. You have met yourself in the depths. You have earned your own trust. You are not untouchable because you built walls. You are untouchable because you have nothing to hide. You have embraced both your light and your darkness. And now, you can walk through the world with open hands and steady eyes. To arrive here is not a single moment of awakening. It is a slow, deliberate process of inner excavation. You unearth your wounds, your forgotten dreams, your childhood fears, and your hidden rage. You listen to them. You dialogue with them. You ask, what do you want me to know? And in that conversation, you reclaim your power. You stop outsourcing your identity to opinions, trends, or traumas. You stop waiting for the world to treat you kindly before you allow yourself to feel whole. Wholeness becomes your baseline, not a reward. The world teaches us that to be strong is to be unaffected. But that is a lie. The truly strong are deeply affected. They feel the suffering, the joy, the injustice, and the wonder of it all. But they have learned how to contain their feelings rather than be consumed by them. They have cultivated an inner vessel strong enough to hold the storm. And that is what makes them untouchable, not because the storm never comes, but because they have become the eye of it. This is the way of the integrated soul. This is the path that asks everything of you, but gives you back something the world cannot offer, inner peace that does not depend on outer circumstance. The wound is the place where the light enters. Yet, in the initial agony of suffering, it rarely feels like light. Pain, especially the kind that lingers in silence, disguises itself as failure, as abandonment, as shame. But within its depths lies the invitation to transformation. Most people run from pain. They distract, deny, suppress, or blame. But those who become truly untouchable in spirit are those who turn inward and ask, what is this pain asking me to become? Not what it is doing to me, but what it is awakening within me. To become powerful without becoming cold, one must first understand the sacred nature of suffering. This is not a romanticization of pain, but a recognition that the psyche, in its deepest intelligence, uses pain as a tool of individuation. There are truths about yourself you will never meet in comfort. There are parts of your soul that only awaken in the fire. This is where power is forged, not in avoiding wounds, but in transmuting them, in standing at the center of what once shattered you, and realizing you did not break, you simply began. The modern world avoids the concept of necessary suffering. It tells you to move on, to forget, to stay positive. But the unconscious does not move on. It only buries what is buried, festers, contorts, becomes projection. It spills into your relationships, poisons your ambitions, colors your view of the world. The pain you refuse to face becomes the master you unconsciously serve. And in serving it, you lose freedom. You become reactive, bitter, hypervigilant. You confuse cynicism for wisdom. You confuse guardedness for insight. But all of this dissolves the moment you face the wound and ask it not to disappear but to speak. In those private, sacred moments of reflection, something happens. You begin to recognize that your suffering is not meaningless. That the betrayal, the rejection, the heartbreak all serve to strip away the parts of you that were never truly yours. Ego identities, false selves, inherited beliefs. Pain pulls them from your hands. And though you may resist, though it may feel like a cruel loss, it is, in truth, a liberation. The self is not interested in your comfort. It is interested in your awakening. And when you submit to that higher intelligence, pain becomes less of a punishment and more of a portal. There is, however, a temptation along the path of awakening. The temptation to mistake coldness for strength. After pain, many become closed not because they have healed, but because they have refused to feel. They wear detachment like armor and call it growth. But emotional indifference is not transformation. It's trauma in disguise. It is easier, yes, to become stoic in the external sense. To look unaffected, to keep others at a distance. To pride oneself on needing no one. But the soul does not bloom in coldness. It blooms in warmth. And warmth requires courage. It requires vulnerability, the willingness to remain open even after being hurt. The truly powerful are not those who feel nothing. They are those who have felt everything, and yet choose to keep their hearts open. They do not become victims of their pain, nor slaves to their fear. They alchemize their wounds into wisdom. And in doing so, they become light bringers, not because they have avoided the dark, but because they have passed through it and returned with gifts. These individuals carry a calmness that is not born of repression, but of realization. They know what they are, and they no longer need to prove it. But in order to reach this level of consciousness, one must confront the danger of false stoicism. This is the stage where many become stuck. They mistake the absence of emotion for healing. But numbness is not a destination, it is a signal. A sign that the psyche has withdrawn its energy inward, because the external world has become too unsafe, too overwhelming. In this state, people may function, perhaps even excel, but they do so from a place of quiet despair. Their joy feels muted. Their connections feel hollow. And though they wear the mask of resilience, they live behind walls they do not know how to tear down. The cold person is not free. They are in exile. Exile from their own soul. From the songs they once sang as a child. From the dreams they were too afraid to pursue. From the love they were too afraid to receive. But healing asks for a return. Not to the past, but to the self that was buried beneath the protective adaptations. To thaw the frozen parts of the psyche requires gentleness, not force, not shame, but presence. The kind of presence that says, I see you. You don't need to pretend anymore. Only in that space of radical self-acceptance does real transformation occur. The individual begins to understand that power is not built on denial, it is built on awareness. And this awareness extends not only to one's own wounds, but to one's capacity for wholeness. To be whole is to feel deeply while remaining grounded, to experience sorrow and still love, to be angry and still act with integrity, to know betrayal and still believe in goodness. This is the paradox. The ego resists, but the soul understands. It is not an either or, it is a both and. You do not need to choose between strength and softness, between clarity and compassion, between depth and detachment. You are capable of being both resilient and tender, both fierce and forgiving. The task is to integrate, not eliminate. And this is where the true inner work lies. Integration requires you to bring all parts of yourself into conscious relationship. The wounded child, the inner critic, the abandoned dreamer, the hopeful seeker. You do not cast them aside. You invite them in. You listen to their stories. You learn their needs. And in doing so, you reclaim your full self. This is how you become a fortress of light. Not by becoming impermeable, but by becoming internally unified. Light is not fragile. It is the most pervasive force in the universe. But to embody light, you must pass through darkness. You must understand that being untouchable is not about hiding your scars. It is about owning them, letting them breathe, letting them speak. Because in those scars are the stories that will liberate others. The ones who are still in hiding, still in exile, still believing that to be strong is to be silent, to be unfeeling, to be alone. But you were not meant to walk this path alone, nor were you meant to shrink yourself to fit the expectations of a numb society. You were meant to feel profoundly, to connect deeply, to express without apology, to love without bargaining your soul. And yet, to do all of this while remaining sovereign within yourself. That is the art, the balance, the sacred tension of the individuated life. The world will tell you that this cannot be done, that to survive, you must harden. But your soul knows otherwise. It remembers the time before the wounds, before the masks, before the fear, and the soul waits patiently for your return. Not to innocence, but to essence. To the original wholeness that was never truly lost, only hidden. You do not need to reinvent yourself. You need only to remove what is not you. What was adopted in fear, in pain, in survival. What no longer serves your becoming. The journey of individuation is not about adding, it is about shedding. And in the shedding, you begin to shine. Not with the forced light of performance, but with the steady glow of authenticity. You walk into a room and your presence speaks. Before you do. Not because you are loud, but because you are clear. Clear in your intentions. Clear in your boundaries. Clear in your purpose. And that clarity, that quiet certainty, makes you untouchable. Not because you repel life, but because you can now participate in it fully, without losing yourself. You do not grasp. You do not chase. You do not beg. You stand. You allow. You receive. And in that posture, you become magnetic not to the world's illusions, but to the people, experiences, and opportunities that reflect your true self. Such a person is not merely strong. They are luminous. They radiate an inner peace that no external chaos can shake, and others feel it. They do not always understand it, but they sense it. Because in the presence of such a person, others are confronted with their own fragmentation. Some will admire, some will resent, but you no longer need their validation or fear their projection. You know who you are. And that knowing is your sanctuary. The journey is not easy. It requires death of ego identities, of false attachments, of outdated beliefs. But in that, death is rebirth. And in that rebirth is freedom. Not the freedom of escape, but the freedom of full embodiment. You come home to yourself. You rest in yourself. And from that resting place, you move through the world, not untouched, but transformed. Not disconnected, but deeply rooted. Not cold, but awakened. And the light that you carry does not need to be protected. It protects you.